Looking out from the terminal window in the wee hours of the October morning, the infusion of crimson and lilac colors graced the smoggy sky. The people in the airport were lethargically planted in their seats, while the airline personnel stood dully at their post. My little brother and I were the only ones wide awake from our caffeine wiring, combined with the temporary energy ignition from a McDonald's breakfast. As I waited to board the flight to Miami, Florida, I listened to the sporadic roll of wheels on the pearly white speckled floor and glanced at this quick-tempered woman who continuously twitched at the screams of a young child across the departure lounge. I was entranced by this peculiar lady because her patience wore thin, like a fragile string on a banjo ready for its last pluck. Once the staff greenlit us to board, my mother quickly nudged my shoulder to alert our hasty uprising. We were first in line to board the A section, the boarding passes in hand, backpack zipped, as we smoothly treaded down the hollow tarmac. Right as I walked past the artificially cordial flight attendants,
Welcome aboard.
I was adorned by the non-claustrophobic empty aisles and the plushy luminescent baby blue seats. My mother immediately scooted her way into the first aisle, as my brother and I closely followed. My brother propped both my mother and my small carry-on suitcases onto the drably painted overhead bins as the rest of the passengers piled in behind us. Once we were settled, my brother and I played our favorite airplane game, People Watch. As the rest of the passengers stuttered in, the variety of different faces amused us. One man stood in the middle of the aisle, allowing people to pass him by because he was unsure of what seat to sit in. His diaphoretic face was drenched with fear and displacement, as if this was his first time on an airplane. Another woman was as contagious as the bubonic plague. She wore a germ protection mask and latex gloves, with a cough that sounded as if parasites were feasting on her fragile lungs. The next noticeable prospect was the disturbed woman from the departure lounge. She was as creepy as a porcelain doll placed in a haunted house. She was definitely in her late 40s, yet her face was pulled back far enough it could replace a slingshot. Her body was extremely muscular, which downplayed the strained softness in her extremely pale facial appearance. Her hair was bleached blonde, which wiped her out completely, leaving her chiseled cheekbones as a shadow to break the harsh arrangement of her heightened features. The sounds began to build up from the chatter and occasional dings from the pilot channels, and the subtle escalation of noise became seemingly bothersome to the impetuous woman, as her nostrils began to flare and her cheeks broke out into microscopic hives. My brother and I turned to each other in utter discontent, hoping she would not sit adjacent to us, but that she did. She swiftly hauled up her bags into the shelves and sat down gracefully. She was very agile and flexible, but slightly odd when she crossed her legs into a Buddhist praying position. More people began to take their seats, as two scrawny twin men sat beside her. The last members to board happened to consist of the crying baby who agitated the twitching woman's peace, along with his two densely inconsiderate parents, and the only seats that were left were the ones directly behind the impulsive woman. By this time, my mother had already fallen to a deep sleep, which was routinely normal. Once everyone had taken their seats, we immediately prepared for takeoff. While we still remained on the runway, the flight attendants on both sides of the plane held up little pamphlets instructing us of what to do in case of an emergency. And once that humdrum spiel was done with, the plane was near departure. However, soon after the flight attendants left the aisles, the screeching shrill of a naughty brat echoed all the way to the last cabin row. The small child reeked of a stench that only days without a bath could bring. His parents were doe-eyed newbies that seemed as if they gave up on parenting and just let him holler. And by no surprise, the woman across from me lit up faster than a kerosene fire in the summertime. She immediately wriggled her way out of her positioning and popped her head over the seat. Her pupils were dilated, and the hairs on her head rose from static formulation. She lunged her fist right at the boy's jaw, but her swing thankfully missed. Her chaotic amplification caused a major scene, so I decided to alert the nearest flight attendant, and right as I did, she whipped her head in my direction and screamed at the top of her lungs. My mother jolted awake at this ludicrous crisis that scarred a permanent scowl on her face as she tried to figure out the situation through my brother. The parents of the child sprung up and called for help. The twins sitting next to her crossed their arms in front of their face and leaned against the window. All of the passengers were alerted by this time and enraged by this deranged animalistic woman. She would not stop staring at me, alternating a heroin-like scratch of the arm with an eerie burst of laughter. I decided to look away, as my mother made an effort to share eyes with her, when suddenly she yelled,
"Shut up, all of you! You disgusting rats! Bleed and bleed some more!"
The place flew up in uproar, as many people cussed at her and alerted the flight crew. One by one, each flight attendant rushed to the scene to deal with this demented head case. The lady was clearly having an out-of-body experience or hearing voices at this point. She threw out racial slurs to me as well as an Indian man across the way. A teenager stood up and yelled,
"Yo, this lady's on bath salts!"
The flight attendants huddled around her until a pilot could call for help. But through the warm-bodied flight crew, I could still see the woman's eyes piercing directly at me as she winked uncontrollably. The twin passengers beside her jumped over her and frantically moved into the middle of the aisle to get away from her possessed soul. Not long after, the police arrived and escorted the dingbat off the plane. As she got up, she uttered to the officers with a calming voice,
"Sorry, officers. It must have been the turbulence."
and she was gone.